There is no agreement among experts on what is the actual number of languages in the world. The numerical evaluations range from a minimum of about 4,000 to a maximum of 11,000 languages. This large gap between the sources depends on the difficulties associated with the very definition of language and above all by the notion of language and dialect. As often happens in cases of significant divergence of views, the truth probably lies in the middle. The ethnologue database Languages of the World lists to be exact 7,105 languages. It is good to keep in mind that about 5,000 languages are concentrated in just 22 countries. Papua New Guinea has the highest concentration with 820 languages, followed by Indonesia and Nigeria. There is a set of languages, 20 in all, which are characterized by a large number of speakers, over 100 million. Together, these languages cover 50% of the communication needs of the world population and are spoken mainly by dominant linguistic communities. On the other hand, there is a huge number of languages spoken by a few speakers, a few thousands, a few hundred, or a few tens of individuals. Nowadays, many of these languages are labeled as endangered languages. These are characterized by a more or less marked process of language obsolescence. Ceasing to be actively used, these languages have been abandoned by the native speakers in favor of another language, often one of the dominant languages, such as English. The extinction of languages is a growing phenomenon and data are increasingly alarming. Language is one of the elements that makes up the cultural heritage of a population or community. It is the link between a community and its world. Language describes it, it analyzes it, and it allows the transfer of knowledge to new generations. Language mediates the mutual interaction between man, his environment, and his fellows. Moreover, it helps the individual to build connections with the past, and therefore it helps building an identity shared by all the speakers of a particular language. Linguistic diversity mirrors cultural diversity. Thus, the death of a language is a symptom of a cultural death, and its destiny is strictly related to those of its speakers. This connection helps us understand why the term ecology is particularly suitable in the case of languages. The word comes from the Greek oikos, meaning home. A language thus exists only where there is a community that speaks and transmits it. A community of people can only exist in an environment where it is possible to find means to survive, or to put it in a more capitalistic point of view, where there is a sustainable economic system. Where communities cannot thrive, their language is in danger, and when they lose their speakers, languages die. This is what I mean when I talk about ecolinguistic. A language is part of a social and geographical matrix in the same way that a rare species is part of an ecosystem. A moderate environmental change can lead to massive extinctions with an increasing pressures on interconnected species. In order to diagnose the state of well-being of a language, it may be useful to consider a number of parameters. First, intergenerational transmission. The health status of a language is solid when the adults of the linguistic community who use it feel a moral obligation to pass it on to younger generations. The number of speakers. The extent of social-linguistic dominance of use. The presence of a recognized writing system. The language being taught as cool. And the attitude of the members of the linguistic communities in respect of their language, how much a language is felt and understood as a fundamental identity factor. Therefore, a language can be considered at risk of extinction when the older members of the linguistic community do not feel the need, moral and material, to transmit their language to the younger generation, but rather tend to promote another language seen as a tool of greater prestige. When it has a small number of speakers, when it is used in limited contexts, for example, only or mainly as a means of communication within the family group or in the daily interactions of an informal nature, when local authorities do not promote its use, when it is not characterized and strengthened by the presence of a writing system officially recognized, when it is not supported by an educational system, and when the area where the language is spoken is marked by substantial migration from rural to urban areas. The extinction of a language has as a direct consequence the reduction of linguistic diversity. If it is true that one of the main goals of language sciences is to establish the essential parameters of a universal grammar, it is evident that the reduction of linguistic diversity deeply restricts this aim. Moreover, differences between languages show the extraordinary plasticity of the mind and the way in which the language has evolved over thousands of generations. The study of the linguistic faculty is among those that have provided the greatest number of interesting data about how the mind works. Most importantly, some languages contain incredible information and knowledge about the environment, use of medicinal plants, or zoological variety that are still unknown to the Western world. This knowledge, in most cases, would die with the language that encodes it.
Those languages entail in them bodies of knowledge about the environment that simply doesn't exist in English and the other dominant languages.
That's John Hobson. He trains Indigenous language teachers at Sydney University. He's one of a growing number of linguists who've come to understand that language diversity and environmental health are strongly connected.
So whether it's in the Brazilian rainforests or whether it's in the central deserts of Australia, there are generations, centuries, thousands of years of knowledge, accumulated knowledge about the environment, the flora and the fauna and the medicinal uses of plants. That knowledge is entailed in those languages. You lose the language, you lose the ability to talk about those ideas. So what the Western world sees as a great discovery, is often something that an Indigenous population has known about for thousands of years.
And has a name for.
And can classify and, can give you a great deal of information about if you only bother to talk to them.
John Hobson from Sydney University.
The new research from Dan Everett, University of Manchester, on the language of the Piraha tribe in the Amazon is dealing with linguistic pillars of grammar and translation. The Piraha are hunters and fishermen of great ability, and their language highlights the complexity of their verbs and sound systems. The Piraha language and culture present several unique features in the world. Their language contains no words for numbers, pronouns, and colours, and despite their grammar lacks of tenses and their phonetic system is made up of only 8 consonants, 7 in the case of women, and 3 vowels, the Piraha managed to communicate without the slightest difficulty. Finally, the Piraha seem unable to create subordinate clauses, or in other words, they lack what Chomsky called recursion. Without this recursive ability, which basically consists in being able to introduce clauses in other clauses without limitation, the Piraha language is not able to create, to abstract and to generate ideas beyond experience. Until now, the recursion was identified in each language, and Chomsky regarded it as a key element of the human brain, leading him to assert that there is a universal grammar, a sort of genetic linguistic fingerprint, which is identical for everyone. So, we may think of the Piraha as radical empiricists, apologists of the carpe diem, unable to detach themselves from reality and create fictions. In fact, they do not have art, painting, and sculpture. The aim of this presentation is not to dwell into a debate about the veracity of Chomskyan linguistics, but rather to point out that, as the Piraha language has unique characteristics that may reshape some theories of modern linguistics, other isolated languages, such as those found in Papua New Guinea, may hide similar surprises. Hence, the importance of language preservation in order to avoid losing pieces of a puzzle that may help us understand more about the complexity of human communication.